Okay, you guys, I want to go over the adding and subtracting of integers one more time. And I have these cool visuals that I hope will help you. You are going to have to really look at them and kind of slow down and take your time, do some thinking through it, but I know you can do it. And I hope that these help you with the quizzes you're going to take today. So let's start. Adding integers. Well, you know already that if you add a positive with a positive, I'm looking at this first one. If you add a positive with a positive, I don't think I like that pen. Okay. So like if I took a 4 and a 5, I would end up with a positive. We know that. I hope you also realize that if you have two negatives and you add those together, you're going to have a negative. Sorry about my stylus. I've ordered a new one. It's not working very well. But let's look at this one now. I want you to notice that the plus sign here, the first positive sign, is bigger than the other two. So what that's telling you is if you have a bigger number, let's say you have an 8, and then you're adding a smaller negative. You're adding a smaller negative, like let's say -2. What they're telling you is your answer's going to be positive. Now, I want to look at this though. If we're adding a negative, I want you to ask yourself, is the number going to go up or down? Well, if it was a +2, it would go up, but if it's a -2, it's going to go down. You have to kind of stop and ask yourself this and kind of use some common sense. So 8 plus -2, that's pretty much like subtracting. In fact, when we are adding different signs, the first thing we do is subtract. So 8 minus 2 is 6. Goodness, it's not working, is it? It's 6. Let's see if I can use my finger. That's a little better. Okay, but we want to know what the sign is going to be. Well, the bigger number is 8. It's positive. So that tells us that our answer is going to be positive. But let's look at another one. What if we had a +2? So if we see right here, it's smaller than the negative, and I add a -8. Again, when we have different signs, the first thing we do is subtract. So 8 minus 2 is 6. We're going to start there. But then we have to decide what's our sign. Well, who do we have more of? Do we have more positives or negatives? We have more negatives because 8 is bigger than 2. So that tells me their answer is going to be -6. So I hope that this little diagram, this little illustration is helpful to you. It's actually in your quiz. I embedded it into your quiz so you can refer to it if it's helpful. Let's look at the one for subtraction. This one also works. So if I have a positive number, any positive number, so let's say I have a 3, and I subtract a negative, I'm going to have a positive. Because if you have two negatives in a row, those both turn into positives. Okay, so 3 minus -4 is the same as 3 plus 4, and that is a positive. So this diagram is telling us the truth. So if I have a negative, if I start with a -3 and I subtract a positive, my answer will be negative. That's because if you can imagine a number line, if I start on -3 and I take 4 away, I'm going to the left. -7. Now the circles are starting to kind of have bigger and smaller shapes. So we have to pay attention to that and know that this first bigger one is representing a bigger number. So if I take a 5, and that's positive, and I subtract a number that's smaller than 5, like 2, well, I'm going to have a positive answer. If I take, let's look at the next one. If I take a small number and it's a negative, like say -2, and I subtract something that's bigger than -2, but it's also a negative, I'm going to have a positive. So this is -2, basically plus, remember if you have two negatives together, just turn them into a plus, 7. Now, what am I going to do about that? Am I going to add the 2 and the 7? Well, no, because the 2 is negative. So again, if you're adding different signs, the first thing you do is subtract. I'm going to end up with a 5. And then I have to ask myself, so is that going to be a positive 5 or a negative 5? Well, who do I have more of? The 7, which is positive, is more than the 2, which is negative. So if I have more positives, my answer is going to be a positive 5. And that's what this little diagram is saying. Let's look at the next one. So if I start with a small number and it's positive, and I subtract a bigger number that's positive, I'm going to end up with a negative. Well, that makes sense because again, if you picture that number line and we start at 2 and we have to go backwards 5, we're going to pass right by that 0 and be into negative territory. Okay? So I'm going to have a negative 3. And the last one is it's telling us that if we start with a big negative, so say negative 7, and we subtract a smaller one, this says we're going to end up with a negative. Let's see if that makes sense to us. So negative 7 minus negative 2. Again, two negatives. I can just turn them into positives. So now I have a negative 7 and a positive 2. I have different signs. So the first thing I do is subtract. 7 minus 2 is 5. Now my job is to figure out what's the sign. Well, who do I have more of? I have 2 positives, but I have 7 negatives. So I have more negatives than positives. So my answer will be negative.